The shuttle dropped through clouds that smelled like copper and wet stone, and Kira Vasquez pressed her forehead against the window to watch the jungle of Verath 4 rise up to meet her. She had read the briefing files 3 times on the way here, but nothing in those files had prepared her for how alive this world looked from above. Rivers of bright green cutting through valleys of dark red soil, and everywhere the steam rising from geothermal vents like the planet itself was breathing. The pilot said something about turbulence, but Kira was not listening, because she had already spotted the colony below, a cluster of human prefab buildings sitting awkwardly beside the towering organic structures of the Verathi settlement. And she thought the 2 architectures looked like they were having an argument that neither side wanted to finish. When the shuttle landed and the door hissed open, the heat hit her like a wall, and the gravity pulled at her bones. And she understood immediately why the briefing had recommended exothermal suits for all outdoor activity. She did not plan to wear one. A figure was waiting for her at the landing pad, tall, almost 2 meters, with a body that reminded her of something between an insect and a deer, covered in plates of dark amber chitin that caught the light like polished wood, and 4 arms folded in what she would later learn was the Verathi posture of formal tolerance. "Sergeant Vasquez," the figure said, and his voice had a clicking undertone beneath the translated words. "I am Liaison Chirek, and I have been assigned to your engineering team as cultural and diplomatic coordinator." Kira grabbed her duffel bag and slung it over her shoulder, and stuck out her hand before remembering that Verathi did not shake hands, so she turned the gesture into an awkward wave. "Good to meet you, Chirek. Just call me Kira." Chirek's large amber eyes blinked sideways, which she would later learn meant he was filing something away for analysis. "I will call you Sergeant Vasquez, as protocol requires." That was how it started between them, professional and cool and careful, in the way that 2 species who did not understand each other always were at the beginning. Over the next several days, Kira settled into her work, which was to inspect and reinforce the colony's geothermal power grid, a network of energy harvesting stations built over the natural vents that made Verath 4 so valuable to the Galactic Cooperative. The work was straightforward, but the environment was not, because the jungle was loud and hot and full of creatures that screamed at night, and the gravity made every tool feel heavier and every staircase feel longer. Chirek followed her everywhere, recording observations on a slim data slate and asking questions that were polite on the surface, but carried an edge of something she could not quite name. "You run every morning in the high-gravity zone, without respiratory support," he noted one evening as they reviewed her inspection reports. "I like running. The atmospheric density here causes measurable strain on human cardiovascular systems. I still like running." Chirek clicked softly, which she was beginning to recognize as his version of a sigh. She learned quickly that the Verathi thought humans were strange, not dangerous, not stupid, but deeply and fundamentally irrational, in ways that made them uncomfortable. The whole galaxy knew that humans ate capsaicin for pleasure and drank ethanol for fun, and kept predators in their homes as companions. And these facts were cited in xenobiology courses across the cooperative, as examples of what the textbooks called biochemical recklessness. Chirek had clearly studied those textbooks, but Kira was not here to change anyone's mind about humans. She was here to fix power systems, and that was what she intended to do. On her 5th day, she was inspecting Vent Cluster 7, a grouping of 6 geothermal taps on the eastern ridge, when she noticed something that made her stop walking. The pressure seals on 2 of the taps were showing micro-fractures, tiny cracks spreading through the ceramic like veins in a leaf, and the temperature readings were climbing in a pattern she had seen before, not on an alien world, but in textbooks about cascade failures in Earth's early geothermal plants. She pulled up the structural data on her tablet and ran the numbers twice, and then a 3rd time because she did not want to be right. "Chirek," she said, and something in her voice made him look up from his data slate. These seals are degrading faster than the maintenance schedule accounts for. If the pressure builds without release, this whole cluster could blow sideways through the basalt shelf. Chirrut studied the data she showed him, and then contacted the Verithai engineering team. After a long conversation, full of clicking and harmonic tones, he turned back to her. Our engineers have reviewed the data, and they believe the system will restabilize within normal parameters. This pattern has occurred before, and has always resolved. When did it occur before? 17 cycles ago. And was the nursery creche located 200 meters downhill at that time? Chirrut paused, and his amber eyes blinked once. No, the creche was relocated to its current position 8 cycles ago. Kira looked down the slope toward the creche, a beautiful domed structure of woven organic material, where she had seen dozens of Verithai cubs playing just that morning. Small creatures, with soft chitin and enormous eyes, who tumbled over each other and made sounds like tiny bells. Those cubs are in the blast path if this goes wrong, she said quietly. Our engineers are confident it will not go wrong. Learned enough about Verithai culture to know that pushing harder right now would only make them push back, so she nodded and said nothing more, and walked back to her quarters as the sun set behind the jungle canopy. That night, she dreamed about fire. It was always the same dream, the hallway of her childhood home filled with orange light and black smoke, and her brother calling from behind a door that she could not make herself open because her body had locked in place. Every muscle frozen, every nerve screaming at her to run the other way. She was 16 in the dream, and she was always 16, and the door was always closed, and her brother was always calling. She woke up gasping with her hands gripping the sheets and sweat running down her face, and she sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the alien jungle outside her window. In the morning, she went back to Vent Cluster 7 alone and checked the readings again. Overnight. The microfractures had grown. She stood there in the humid air with her tablet in her hands, and the numbers on the screen, and the sound of cubs playing somewhere below her, and she said to no one at all, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "That is not stable." Kira spent the next morning building her case, pulling together every data point she could find on Vent Cluster 7, the pressure curves, the fracture maps, the thermal expansion models, and she organized everything into a report that was clean and clear and impossible to misread. She submitted the report to Captain Herrera, the Human Contingent's commanding officer, and she submitted a translated copy to the Verithai Council through Chirrut. And then she sat in her quarters and waited for someone to take it seriously. Captain Herrera responded first with a short message that said he would forward her concerns to Orbital Command, but that he could not order an evacuation of a Verithai structure without Verithai authorization. The Verithai Council responded next through Chirrut, who delivered their answer with the careful tone of someone trying very hard to be diplomatic. The Council has reviewed your report, and they appreciate your diligence. Geological models do not support your conclusions. They believe the vent system is operating within acceptable ranges, and that no action is required at this time. Their models are wrong, Kira said. They have been monitoring this vent system for over 40 cycles, Sergeant Vasquez. You have been here for 9 days. The words were not cruel, but they landed hard, because Kira knew how they sounded from the outside. A human who had barely unpacked her bags, telling an entire civilization that they did not understand their own planet. She tried a different approach, and requested a meeting with Elder Morvathi, the clan mother of the local settlement, because if anyone had the authority to order the creche moved, it was her. The meeting took place in Morvathi's chamber, a vast circular room at the heart of the Verithai settlement, with walls made of living wood that pulsed faintly with bioluminescence. Morvathi was old, ancient by Verithai standards, 6 limbs and chitin that had faded from amber to pale silver, and she sat on a raised platform, surrounded by attendants, who watched Kira with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion. Chirek translated as Kira laid out her case, pointing to the data on her tablet, explaining the physics of cascade failures in pressurized geothermal systems, describing what would happen if superheated gas found a lateral escape path through fractured rock. Morvathi listened, without interrupting, and when Kira finished, the old clan mother was silent for a long time before she spoke. "You ask me to move the creche," Chirek translated, and his voice carried a weight that told Kira this was not a simple request. The cubs are in the 4th week of the bonding cycle. This is the period when they form their deepest connections to their clutch siblings and to the place of their birth. To move them now would cause developmental harm that could last their entire lives. Respect, elder. Developmental harm is better than being dead. The room went cold, and Kira knew immediately that she had pushed too far, because Morvathi's attendance shifted and clicked in a sharp harmonic pattern that needed no translation. "You have been on our world for 9 days, Morvathi said through Chirek, and her voice was level but hard. "And you presume to tell us what threatens our children. We have kept our cubs safe for 1,000 generations, human. We do not need your fear." The meeting was over. Kira walked back to the human compound in the fading light, with Chirek beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long time, until they reached the path where their routes split. "You think I am wrong," Kira said. Chirek was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that surprised her. "I think you believe what you are saying, and I think your data is not easy to dismiss. But the Varathai have a relationship with this land that you cannot understand in 9 days. And Elder Morvathi has earned the right to trust her judgment." "What about the cubs, Chirek? Do they get a say in whose judgment is right?" He did not answer that. In her quarters that night, Kira tried to contact Orbital Command directly, thinking she could go over everyone's heads and get an independent geological assessment ordered. But the solar storm that had been building for days had finally hit, and the long-range comms were nothing but static and noise. She was on her own. So she did the only thing she could think of that did not require anyone's permission. She began to prepare. Over the next 36 hours, working in the early mornings and late evenings when the jungle was quieter and fewer eyes were watching, she moved supplies to a small storage alcove near the creche. 3 emergency thermal blankets rated for 800 degrees, 4 portable oxygen canisters, a plasma cutting tool, 2 bottles of water, and a first aid kit. She told no one what she was doing. But Chirek noticed, because Chirek noticed everything, and on the second evening, he found her coming back from the alcove with empty hands and a tight expression. "What are you doing, Sergeant Vasquez?" "Being paranoid. Apparently that is what humans do." He studied her for a long moment with those sideways blinking amber eyes. "Why does this matter so much to you? It is not your creche, these are not your cubs, and this is not your world." Kira leaned against the corridor wall and crossed her arms and looked at the floor, and for a moment she almost told him everything. The fire, the door, her brother's voice, but the words stuck in her throat the way they always did. "Because I have seen what fire does when you give it time," she said instead, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not. Chirek looked at her hands, and then at her face, and then he turned and walked away without another word. That night, the ground shook. Kira was lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, when the first tremor hit, a deep, low vibration that rattled the water glass on her desk and made the walls groan. And she was on her feet and pulling on her boots before the vibration had even stopped. Her tablet lit up with alerts. Pressure readings from Vent Cluster 7, spiking past every threshold she had flagged in her report, climbing so fast the graph could barely keep up. A second tremor hit, stronger than the first, and somewhere outside, an alarm began to wail. Not a human alarm, but a Varathai one, a deep resonant horn sound that she had been told was only used for the most extreme emergencies. She ran outside and looked toward the eastern ridge, and what she saw stopped her in her tracks. The ridge was glowing. A crack had opened in the basalt shelf just as she had predicted, and through that crack, a river of superheated gas and molten material was pouring out sideways in a plume of white and orange that lit up the jungle like a second sunrise, and it was flowing downhill toward the creche. Kira broke into a sprint. The air was already hard to breathe by the time Kira reached the creche, thick with heat and the sharp chemical smell of vaporized rock, and the scene in front of her was something out of a nightmare she had lived before. The thermal plume from Vent Cluster 7 had carved a river of fire across the hillside, and it had reached the eastern wall of the creche and split around the structure like water around a stone, and the heat radiating from that river was so intense that the jungle on both sides had simply ceased to exist. Trees turned to carbon shadows in seconds. Soil turned to glass. Verathai adults were everywhere, dozens of them, screaming in harmonic frequencies that hit Kira's chest like physical blows, and she could see in their movements the terrible math they were all doing at once. The creche was surrounded on three sides by the thermal flow, and the only approach was a narrow corridor on the western side that was not yet blocked but was filling with radiant heat that rose like a wall of invisible knives. 3 Verathai parents had already tried to go in. She could see 2 of them on the ground near the corridor entrance, their beautiful amber chitin cracked and blackened, their bodies curled in the involuntary fetal position that meant thermal shock had shut down their nervous systems, and a third was being dragged back by 4 others, while she thrashed and keened a sound so raw that Kira felt it in her teeth. The Verathai could not survive the heat corridor. Their chitin conducted temperature too efficiently, and what would be painful for a human was lethal for them in seconds. Kira pushed through the crowd and reached the corridor entrance, and felt the heat hit her face like opening an oven. And she looked through the shimmering air at the creche door 30 meters away, and saw that the emergency fire doors had sealed automatically, just as they were designed to do. The cubs were sealed inside. Up the creche's internal sensors on her tablet, and counted the life signs. 11. There were 11 cubs still in there, alive because the insulated walls were holding, but not for long, because the internal temperature was climbing steadily, and the walls were beginning to glow at the edges. She had minutes, maybe less. Kira ran to her supply alcove and grabbed the thermal blankets and the oxygen canisters and the cutting tool, and she dragged everything back to the corridor entrance, where Chirek found her, on her knees, wrapping herself in the largest thermal blanket. Kira, what are you doing? The blankets are rated for 800 degrees. The corridor is 1400. I know. You will die. Maybe. This is not rational. The first imperative exists for a reason. Every species has the right and the duty to preserve its own life. What you are doing is Chirek. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with tears that evaporated almost as fast as they formed in the radiating heat. And her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the blanket, and every single cell in her body was telling her to run, to turn around, to save herself, to live. She was 16 years old again, standing at a burning door. Her brother was calling. Her muscles were locking. Her vision was narrowing to a single point of light at the end of a dark tunnel, and the light was orange and hot, and it smelled like the end of everything. And the impulse to survive was so strong it was like a hand on her chest pushing her backward, pushing her away, screaming at her in the most ancient language her body knew. Run, run, run! You will die here! Run! And she heard it. She heard every word of it, and she stood up anyway. There are 11 children in there, she said, and her voice cracked but did not break, and I am going to go get them. Blanket over her head and shoulders, and she picked up the cutting tool and 2 oxygen canisters, and she walked into the corridor. The heat was immediate and total and everywhere. It came through the blanket like the blanket was not there, pressing against her skin with a weight that felt solid. And within the first 5 steps, her boots began to soften and stick to the ground. And the air she was breathing through the oxygen mask was so hot it burned her throat on the way down. She could not see clearly, because the air itself was distorted, rippling and bending the light, turning the creche door into a wavering mirage that seemed to move further away with every step. 10 meters in, and the pain arrived, not gradually, but all at once, like her entire body had been dipped in something caustic, and she heard herself make a sound that was not a scream and not a word, but something older than both. She kept walking. 15 meters, and the thermal blanket was smoking. Tiny wisps of white curling up from the edges, and she could smell something burning that she realized was her own hair where it had escaped the blanket's cover. 20 meters, and her hands were blistering inside her gloves, and the cutting tool was almost too hot to hold, and she was counting steps because counting was the only thing keeping her mind from shutting down. 25 meters, and she could hear them, the cubs, a high thin sound like crystal being struck, their distress calls filtering through the sealed door. And that sound did something to her that the pain could not undo. It made her faster. She reached the door and pressed the cutting tool against the emergency seal, and activated it, and the plasma blade bit through the metal in a shower of sparks that burned her forearms. And she cut a line down and across, and kicked the panel inward, and there they were. 11 Verathi cubs huddled in the center of the room, pressed together in a tight ball of soft chitin, and trembling limbs, and enormous terrified eyes, and the smallest one, barely old enough to stand on its own 4 legs, looked up at her, and reached out with both forelimbs, and made a sound so small and so afraid that something inside Kira's chest broke open in a way that would never fully close again. She wrapped 5 of them in the 2 spare thermal blankets she had carried in, and she picked them up. They were lighter than human children, but there were 5 of them, and the weight was still significant. And she turned and walked back through the corridor. The return trip was worse, because she knew exactly how much it would hurt. She made it through, and set the cubs down in the arms of the waiting Verathi, and she turned around and went back in. The second trip she carried 4 more, 2 under each arm, and the thermal blanket on her shoulders had stopped smoking, because it had moved past smoking into something else. The outer layer was charring, flaking away in black pieces that floated up into the heat shimmer like dark snow. She made it through, and the Verathi took the cubs from her arms, and someone was shouting at her in a language she did not understand, but she was already turning around. Third trip. 2 cubs left, the smallest one, and 1 other who had been hiding behind a support column. Her legs were not working properly anymore, and her vision was narrowing, and every breath was a raw, scraping agony in her lungs, and the thermal blanket was mostly gone now, just fragments hanging from her shoulders like a burnt flag. She picked up the last 2 cubs and held them against her chest, and she walked into the corridor one final time. She did not remember most of the walk back. She remembered heat and pain, and the small body pressed against her ribs, and the sound of her own heartbeat loud and strange in her ears. And she remembered the light at the end of the corridor. Orange this time, but white. The white of open sky, and she remembered walking toward it. She came out the other side, and her legs gave way, and the ground came up to meet her, and there were hands catching her, 4 of them, strong and chitinous. And she heard Chirek's voice somewhere above her, clicking rapidly in a pattern she had never heard from him before. "Why?" he said, and his translated voice was shaking in a way she did not think Verathi voices could shake. "Why would you do this?" Kira looked up at him through eyes that were swelling shut from the heat damage, and she still had the smallest cub clutched against her chest, and the cub was alive, warm and trembling and alive, and she managed a smile that split her cracked lips and tasted like copper. "Because someone had to," Then everything went dark. Kira woke up in pieces. First the sound of machines humming, then the smell of something sterile and cold, then the pain, which arrived everywhere at once, like an old friend she had not invited. She was in a medical pod on the orbital station above Vera 4, floating in a gel suspension that was doing something complicated to her skin. And when she tried to move her hands, she found that they were wrapped in layers of synthetic tissue, so thick they looked like white mittens. A human nurse appeared above her and told her to stay still, and told her she had been unconscious for 6 days, and told her that the burns covered 40% of her body, and that she was going to be fine. And then the nurse paused and said something else in a voice that was softer and less professional. "The cubs are all alive, all 11 of them. I thought you would want to know that first." Kira closed her eyes and breathed out, and the breath hurt, but not as much as the relief. Over the next 2 weeks she healed slowly in the way that burn patients always do, painfully, impatiently, with long hours of staring at the ceiling, and short bursts of rehabilitation that left her exhausted and shaking. Chirek came to see her on the 9th day. He stood in the doorway of her medical bay for a long time before entering, and when he finally approached her bed, she saw that he was carrying a data slate in his lower left hand, and that his chitin had changed color around his eyes, darker, almost brown, which she had read somewhere was the Verathai expression of deep emotional disturbance. "You look terrible, Chirek." "You are the one in the medical pod, Sergeant Vasquez, and you are the one who looks like he has not slept in 9 days. He clicked softly, that sigh again, and sat down in the chair beside her bed, and for a moment they were quiet together in the way that people who have been through something enormous are. Sometimes quiet, not because there is nothing to say, but because there is too much. Then Chirek placed the data slate on her bedside table. "This is a formal message from Elder Morvathi. She asked me to deliver it personally and to translate it with precision, so I will read it to you exactly as she spoke it." He picked up the slate, and his voice changed, taking on a cadence that was slower and more deliberate, and Kira understood that he was trying to carry not just the words, but the weight behind them. "To the human called Kira Vasquez, I doubted you, and I dismissed you, and I sent you from my chamber with words that were proud and foolish. The fire came as you said it would, and my pride nearly cost me 11 of my children. You entered the fire when my own people could not, and you carried my children out with hands that were burning, and you went back into the flames not once, but 3 times. No Verathai word exists for what you did, because no Verathai has ever imagined that an outsider would do it." Chirek paused, and Kira saw that his lower hands were trembling. "She has declared a clan debt," he continued. "This is the most sacred bond in Verathai culture. It has never been extended to a non-Verathai in our recorded history. And she has given you the title of Shield Mother of the Kresh, which means that in the eyes of Verathai law, you are the honorary mother of every cub you saved. This title is irrevocable, and it is eternal, and it will be spoken in the histories of our people long after both of us are gone." Kira stared at him, and she did not know what to say, so she said the first thing that came to her mind. "I do not know what a shield mother is supposed to do." "Nobody does. You are the first one." Something shifted between them in that moment. Something that had been formal and careful became something else. Something that had room in it for honesty. Chirek told her that he had filed a report with the Galactic Cooperative, and when she tensed, he raised a hand. "Not the report you are expecting. I did not report you for violating the first imperative." "Then what did you report?" "I filed a formal petition to amend the first imperative itself." Kira blinked. The first imperative was the foundational doctrine of the Galactic Cooperative. Self-preservation is sacred. Self-preservation is rational. Self-preservation is the baseline behavior of all sapient life. And Chirek was telling her he had asked them to change it. "My argument he said, leaning forward in his chair with an intensity she had never seen in him before, is that the first imperative contains a fundamental error. It assumes that all sapient species are governed by a single survival hierarchy, but humans are not. He pulled up his research notes on the data slate. Your survival instinct is fully functional, Kira. I monitored your biometric data during the session. Event through your suit's telemetry. Your cortisol levels were extreme. Your heart rate was in the danger zone. Your amygdala was firing at maximum. Every part of your brain was screaming at you to run. It was, she whispered. But you did not run. And this is what I cannot explain using the cooperative's existing models. Because you did not override your survival instinct through logic or training or duty. The telemetry shows that a second impulse activated in your brain simultaneously. An impulse that was just as deep and just as old as the fear. And it was stronger. He looked at her. I am calling it the override. A secondary neurological imperative that exists in humans alongside the survival instinct and that can supersede it when a vulnerable life is perceived to be in danger. It is not a malfunction. It is not irrationality. It is an additional capacity that no other known species in the cooperative possesses at the same depth. For a long time. Then she told him about her brother. She told him about the fire when she was 16, and the hallway full of smoke, and the door she could not open. Not because it was locked, but because her body would not move. Because the survival instinct had her, and it held her in place while her brother called her name. She told him that she had spent 16 years believing that moment proved she was a coward, that her instinct to save herself had revealed something selfish and broken at the center of who she was. But it was not selfishness, she said, and her voice was thick but steady. It was just biology. It was the first imperative doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And I hated myself for it for 16 years, because I thought it meant I did not love him enough. And now, Chirek asked quietly, now I know that both things were real, the fear and the love, and this time the love was louder. Data slate with a care that suggested he understood he was holding something fragile and important. In the days that followed, news of what happened on Vareth 4 spread across the cooperative in the way that extraordinary things always spread. Quickly, imperfectly, and with a growing tale of speculation and debate. Xenopsychologists from 6 different species requested permission to study the incident, and 3 of them traveled to Vareth 4 in person. And the philosophical question that rippled outward through the cooperative's academic networks was simple and enormous at the same time. What does it mean that there exists a species whose love can override its will to live? The debate was fierce and ongoing, and nowhere near resolution. But something had shifted in the way the galaxy talked about humans. A crack in the old certainty, a new question where there had only been an answer. On the 14th night after the fire, a security alert chimed softly in Kira's medical bay, and the night nurse came in to find a small Verathi cub curled against Kira's unburned left hand. The smallest cub from the creche, the one who had reached for her in the smoke, the one whose name she had since learned was Virik. He had apparently escaped from the planetside nursery, stowed away on a supply shuttle, and navigated the orbital station's corridors until he found her room. And no one could explain how a cub that young had managed any of it. When the nurse tried to move him, he bit her. Kira, half awake and smiling with cracked lips, whispered through the fog of painkillers, "Let him stay." 6 months after the fire, Kira stood on the rebuilt eastern ridge of the Verathi settlement and watched the sunrise paint the jungle in shades of copper and gold. And she flexed her scarred hands in the morning air and felt the tightness of new skin pulling across old wounds. The scars covered her arms from wrist to shoulder and ran across her upper back and down her ribs, and the medical team on the orbital station had offered 3 times to remove them with regenerative grafting, and 3 times she had refused. "They are mine," she had told the confused surgeon. "I earned them." She had requested reassignment to Verathai 4 as the permanent human liaison to the Verathai settlement, and the request had been approved so quickly that she suspected someone high up in the chain of command had decided it would be politically unwise to say no to the woman the entire cooperative was calling the Shield Mother. The title had changed her life in ways she was still learning to understand. Among the Verathai, it carried a weight that went beyond honor. It was a living bond, a place in the structure of the clan that had not existed before, and that had been built specifically for her. And it meant that she was no longer an outsider living beside the settlement, but a member of it. Cubs climbed on her when she walked through the communal areas, gripping her legs and her arms, and sometimes her head with their small soft limbs. And the adults had stopped watching her with suspicion, and started watching her with something that looked from the outside like the Verathai version of affection. A slight loosening of the chitin around the eyes, a warmer harmonic tone when they spoke her name. Elder Morvati had requested her presence at council meetings, and Kira sat among the clan elders, not as an advisor or an observer, but as one of them. And when she spoke, the room listened in a way that still made her uncomfortable, because she had never thought of herself as someone worth listening to. She was learning the Verathai language properly now, not relying on translation software, but practicing the clicks and harmonics with Chirek every evening until her human throat ached from making sounds it was never designed to make. Chirek himself had changed in ways that were harder to name, but impossible to miss. His formal distance had not disappeared entirely. He still called her Sergeant Vasquez in public, and still recorded observations on his data slate. But there was a warmth beneath the formality now, a connection that neither of them had expected, and that both of them protected carefully, in the way you protect something you did not know you needed, until you had it. His petition to the Galactic Cooperative had done something remarkable. The Cooperative's High Council had agreed to form a formal study commission on what Chirek had named the Override. And for the first time in the Cooperative's history, classification of an entire species was being reconsidered. Humans were no longer filed under biochemically reckless in the xenobiology databases, but under a new category that Chirek had proposed and that the Council had accepted after months of debate. The new classification was protectively adaptive. It meant that humanity's willingness to accept harm in defense of others was no longer seen as a dysfunction to be studied, but as a trait to be understood, a capacity that the evolutionary record of no other cooperative species had produced at the same neurological depth. The debate it sparked was enormous and ongoing. Some species welcomed the reclassification as overdue. The Morhani, a small amphibious species known for their empathy research, published a paper arguing that the override explained nearly every major human cultural achievement, from medicine to firefighting to the concept of adoption. Others were troubled by it. The Kellic hegemony, whose civilization was built on pure rational self-interest, issued a formal objection, arguing that glorifying self-destructive behavior set a dangerous precedent for impressionable young species. And some were simply awed. A delegation from the Korathi arrived on Verath 4, 3 months after the fire, and they were the ones Kira had not expected. The Korathi were a quiet, dignified species who had lost their homeworld to a stellar catastrophe 200 years ago, and had survived as a nomadic fleet ever since. And their elder, a thin silver-scaled being, whose name translated roughly as the one who remembers, asked to meet Kira alone. They sat together in the garden outside the rebuilt creche, surrounded by flowering plants that the Verathai children had planted in Kira's honor. And the Korathi elder studied her scars with eyes that held a depth of old grief that Kira recognized immediately, because she had seen it in her own mirror for 16 years. "It true?" the elder asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. That your kind would burn for strangers? Kira thought about this for a long time, because it deserved a long thought. Not all of us, she said, not every time, but enough of us, often enough, that it matters. The elder was silent, and then he reached out with one thin hand and touched her scarred forearm very gently. We Karathi lost our world because no one came. We sent signals for 30 years and no one came. And I have spent my life believing that the universe is a place where species survive alone or do not survive at all. He withdrew his hand. I would like to believe I was wrong. Kira did not know what to say to that, so she simply sat with him in the garden until the sun moved and the shadows changed, and she hoped that her presence was enough of an answer. That evening she found Elder Morvathi and Chirek talking quietly in the corridor outside the council chamber, and she would not have stopped except that she heard her name, and the tone of the conversation told her it was not casual. Morvathi was speaking in the old formal dialect that Kira still struggled to follow. But Chirek was listening with his entire body tilted forward, in the posture of someone receiving something important. Later that night, Chirek told her what Morvathi had said. She said that the Varathai are a species of parents, that everything in our culture is built around the protection of the young, and that any Varathai adult would die for their own cubs without hesitation, because the bond of parent to child is the strongest force our biology produces. He paused. But she said that even the strongest Varathai parent would hesitate for a stranger's cub, not for long, perhaps only for a heartbeat. But the hesitation would exist because the instinct must negotiate with the logic. The love must argue with the fear. Time, even when love wins. Another pause, longer this time. She said that you did not hesitate, that she watched you from the moment you arrived at the creche, and there was no pause, no calculation, no weighing of costs. She said your instinct and your choice were the same thing happening at the same time, and she said that this is not madness. His voice dropped. She said that this is what courage looks like when it becomes reflex. Kira stood in the corridor and felt the weight of those words settle into her, like something she had been waiting to hear her entire life without knowing she was waiting. The next morning was warm and bright, and the rebuilt creche gleamed in the early light, and Kira sat on the low wall outside it, with her scarred hands resting on her knees, and watched the sun come up over the jungle canopy. Virik found her first, because Virik always found her first. He was 6 months older now, and fast and fearless, and he scrambled into her lap, with the confidence of a creature who had decided early and permanently that this particular human belonged to him. The other cubs followed in a tumbling, chiming wave. 11 of them, all alive, all growing, crawling over her shoulders and into her arms, and pulling at her hair with their small, careful limbs. And she laughed, and the sound of it mixed with their bell-like voices, until you could not tell where one ended and the other began. Chirek watched from the pathway with his data slate in his hand, and the morning light caught his chitin and turned it to gold, and he stood there for a long time, just watching. Then he opened his personal log and typed a single entry. I have studied humans for 2 standard years. I have read their literature, mapped their neurology, and observed their behavior under duress. I still do not fully understand them. But I know this, the galaxy is full of species that will fight to survive. Species I have found that will fight to make sure someone else does. I do not think the universe made them by accident. He closed the log and looked up at Kira, who was covered in alien children and laughing in the morning sun, with scars on her hands and joy on her face. And for the first time in his career as a scientist, he did not try to analyze what he was feeling. He simply let himself feel it. And the sun rose over Varath 4 the way it always did, slowly and with warmth, and over a world that was a little different now than it had been before.